So, hi everyone. My name is Jesse. I'm one of the co-founders as well as the chief security officer at a company called Fleetsmith. We're definitely one of the newer entries to the kind of MDM space in the last few years. And today, I'm talking about what I think the Apple Enterprise security roadmap should be. And there's actually a continuation of part one, which I actually gave at Mac DevOps 2 weeks ago. And realized while I was creating that talk, originally I was going to give the same talk at this conference, like exactly the same talk, but there was way too much content. So I split it into part one and part two. Part one is already up on YouTube. Check it out. I'll try not to actually rehash any of that material from part one, including a lot of the background context, which is actually really valuable. So I'll just really briefly skim over that, but I would definitely recommend checking out part one too. Okay. So, I already mentioned that. I didn't really explain what makes Fleetsmith different. We try to really prioritize kind of a modern approach. In the background, we kind of like take a stateful approach, kind of like configuration management almost. But you actually don't really have to know that if you're just using the product, because we wrap it up in a really nice, intuitive user experience. So, I won't go beyond that here. I did actually do quite an extensive interview and talked more about this quite a while ago on the Mac Admins podcast, but if you Google it, you can definitely find it. Prior to Fleetsmith, I was at Dropbox, first as an IT engineer, and then I moved over to security engineering and was on that team for the remainder of my time there, 2.5 years. Saw a lot of growth. The company went from like 130 when I started to almost 2,000 when I left. Pretty wild. Saw kind of both sides of the coin in terms of what IT obviously cares about with, particularly endpoints, but also what security cares about, and kind of like a lot of those learnings have gone into Fleetsmith. So, I think a lot about the intersection of IT and security, particularly when it comes to Apple endpoints, whether that's macOS, iOS, etc. Although today's talk is scoped to macOS. Okay. So out of scope for this talk is going to be physical attacks, just because that's a whole other ballgame, and again, there's just probably not enough time. And I'm worried about even getting through what I have. So maybe for a future talk, I'll talk more about physical attacks. OK, so there's kind of two main categories when you think about security and endpoints, and it's really hardening and detection. For part one, I covered up most of the stuff in the hardening category and didn't get to detection at all. So today we're going to round out the hardening side and get into the detection side. So if you think about defense in depth, you really want to have multiple layers of security so that even if a hacker gets through one layer, they're blocked by the next layer. So you're never relying on a single thing. And there's really two goals. With endpoint security, you want to make it so that it's difficult for an attacker to gain a foothold in the first place and do something on a given device. And then you want to make it difficult for them to move around within the operating system as well as to other devices within your company. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different layers on the hardening side. I talked about quite a few of them already. These are the ones that were covered in part one: the firmware updates, secure boot, notarization, gatekeeper, xProtect, SIP, software update preferences is what I got through. Today we're going to be talking about major macOS upgrades, security updates, which, as I'm sure you all know, are different than regular dot updates or macOS major upgrades, firewall rules, and also binary whitelisting and blacklisting. So the first one I want to talk about is major macOS upgrades in the context of MDM. So I should have actually caveated this at the front. A lot of what I'm talking about, if not all of it actually, is about trying to manage these things that relate to the platform security, hardening, or detection via MDM. Because as you all know, you can't manage everything through just the MDM protocol or just configuration profiles today. And I think Apple wants to move away from a world where agents are running on devices as root, which I'll also love that future. I'm extremely aligned with that vision. But I think there's a gap that needs to be closed in terms of functionality in the MDM protocol and config profiles to allow us to get to the point where that would be a possibility. And so that's really the focus of a lot of these suggestions for a security roadmap, is to make it possible to actually manage all of these things through MDM or through officially supported things. So, major macOS upgrades. There's technically support. If you look in the enforcement column there, there's technically been support for triggering major macOS upgrades, like Mojave to Catalina, for example, through MDM commands for quite a while. But unfortunately, in reality, trying to actually use those MDM commands, there's a lot of problems that you'll encounter. And Victor Vrenchan, or Groob, as you may know him, did an amazing blog post that outlined kind of all the problems that you might encounter as an MDM, solution, whether it's open source or commercial, in trying to use these commands. And so I'm going to walk through some of those here. So the first one is, just in terms of like the reporting side, when you ask a device for information about itself using an MDM command, you actually can't get the time zone information, which means that you can't deliver a great user experience to the employees or your end users because you don't know what time zone they're in. So you have to choose, one time in UTC around the world that's going to reboot everyone's machines. And you're stuck, trying to balance time zones, and it's not going to work out very well for some people. It's going to be inconvenient for one of your offices or one of your locations. And so adding that would go a long way to solving that, because then you can basically set an enforcement or a deadline in local time and just communicate a single time to all of your users and say, hey, this is going to happen at 12 noon on Friday. It doesn't matter what time zone you're in. But you actually can't do that with the MDM protocol because you can't get the time zone information from the device. Okay, next one. This MDM command is currently restricted to DEP devices. You cannot actually use this command on UA MDM devices. So in a world like the one we all live in, where not 100% of every machine was purchased through DEP, this is basically a non-starter. Like, yes, there's an MDM command, but it's not actually going to allow you to get your entire organization upgraded. So not a great solution. So this is why all of us are using start OS install, which is sort of also a blessed way to do OS upgrades. Apple did talk about it at WWDC in the device management talk in 2018. And notably, they did not talk about the MDM command. Interesting. So this is one of the major issues. They really need to open this up and allow it to be used for UA MDM as well as DEP supervised devices. Okay, the user experience as well, not great. So one of the problems is that the actual notification that the user sees is not the OS upgrade notification that you see if you do it through software update as like a consumer. If you do the consumer way, you get this beautiful macOS notification that says, hey, there's an OS upgrade. Do you want to install it later tonight? And then once the actual update hits, you get a little 2-minute countdown timer. It's embedded in the notification. It's beautiful. You get none of that with MDM. It's just a generic thing that says your admin has enforced an update. So the solution here, or the feature request, is to make the MDM command use the actual same notification and the same user experience as the consumer model. Okay, next issue is that the actual OS upgrade itself, the download doesn't even start until you're plugged into battery power, but there's no communication of that requirement to the end user. It's just a silent thing. The MDM server sends the command, and the device seems to just sit there doing nothing. Even if you look at the logs, there's no download happening, nothing. And so the suggestion or feature request here is to show a notification to the end user saying, hey, there's an OS upgrade, and you need to be plugged into battery power, or a power outlet to let the download happen. And there's actually a great example with the FileVault notification that could be used as inspiration for this already. If you unplug from battery power while FileVault's encrypting, you'll actually get a macOS notification saying, hey, you need to plug into power for FileVault to continue. Okay, when you actually click the restart button in the notification, there can be a multi-minute delay. This is also talked about in Groob's blog post. So it seems like nothing's happening, seems like the update's failed. The user might continue to do their work, and then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 minutes later, the machine actually reboots, seemingly out of nowhere. So again, if this actually used the same experience as like the consumer side, the button works immediately. I'm not sure why it's different, but either it should work immediately, or there should be some sort of pending state in design terminology, or screen that tells the user, hey, your device is preparing to reboot, or something like that, so they understand what's going on. It doesn't look like it's just broken. All right, next one. MDM servers can't send macOS notification bubbles, the little pop-up things. So there's no way to actually proactively warn users that something is going to happen in the future. If you want to deliver that functionality today, the only way to do it is via an agent. So that would be an amazing thing, is if you could either generically send notifications as an MDM server and have them say whatever you want at any time, or if that's a little too, flexible, the backup suggestion is to tie it to specific MDM commands that could result in the machine rebooting. So install application, install enterprise application, or the various OS upgrade commands. Okay, security updates. So as you know, these things are separate from the dot updates, separate from the major OS releases, but they do still change the build number of macOS sometimes. And so, it would be great to be able to actually manage, be able to know whether any given device has all the latest security updates installed via an MDM command, and ideally also, say which ones are available so you can understand the delta between what's running on the fleet versus what should be running on the fleet. And all the enforcement stuff, kind of the same scenario as the previous slides in terms of what the experience should be. Okay, so I wanted to put this big caveat in here. Those things are all like just fixing or improving things with the existing MDM commands. The slides to come, many of them actually would require coordination between like the core macOS engineering teams, the MDM team that's actually working on the MDM protocol, and configuration profiles, and would require just a lot of coordination between like security engineering, the MDM team, and core macOS team. And so I wanted to call that out. This is kind of like pushing the boundaries here. Okay, so firewall rules. In terms of reporting, it's actually not possible to know the firewall status in terms of like the rules that are loaded. And there's actually two firewalls in macOS. For those of you who've only used the kind of GUI one, there's the application layer firewall, which is what it sounds like. It's layer 7 firewalling, aka the application layer. So you can say this specific app is allowed to make these connections. And then there's a more conventional firewall that operates at like layer 4. That's IP and port-based firewalling, more traditional firewalling, and that's called PF. And it's actually an incredibly powerful firewall. Came over from OpenBSD, I think, or FreeBSD, I can't remember. But it's a very powerful firewall, and that's actually what PF is using behind the scenes. Or sorry, ALF is using behind the scenes. ALF actually sits on top of PF. But you can't get any information on what firewall rules are loaded for either firewall via MDM commands. And so the feature request there is to introduce an MDM command or add it to the existing MDM security info response so you can understand what's actually going on with the firewall. On the enforcement side, obviously it'd be great to be able to manage specific firewall rules for things like PF with MDM, with like a configuration profile delivered via MDM. So that would let you do things like, let's say, block port 80 and 443 so that, or make it only available on localhost, right? So if you have engineers and they're running local web servers, you actually can allow them to still connect to that local web server on their own computer, but block it from everyone else on whatever network they're on. If they're at Starbucks or at the airport, you don't have random people connecting to this developer's developer environment running on 443 on their macOS machine, right? So that's why it would be really nice to be able to enforce these types of things. Okay, configurable binary, whitelisting, and blacklisting on the hardening side. We'll get to detection later. So on the hardening side, it's just not possible to actually have logging and actual execution blocking of binaries. So if you're familiar with Google Santa, this is really what this is talking about, the ability to have built-in binary execution blocking enforced at the kernel layer in the operating system built in. And so the feature request here is to be able to do that, define like the list of binaries either by hash or by file path, or maybe blacklist or whitelist an entire developer certificate based on the team ID, very similar to kernel extensions, if you're familiar with that. You can imagine the same model applying to blacklisting binaries. So you could say, for this developer, I want to block everyone from running, any software from this Apple developer team ID because we don't trust them. Cool. Detection. Okay, so we've finished the hardening side. Let's move to detection. What's the goal of detection? So we want to actually reduce the time to discovery of a breach. So everyone knows breaches happen. They seem to be happening more and more often to more and more organizations. And it's like, wouldn't it be obvious, though, if we got hacked? Wouldn't we know that right away? It would be like the hackers are in the system. They're there. They're just, stealing all the stuff. But no, it's actually really not obvious. And in fact, this is from the Verizon DBIR 2019 report, considered kind of like gold standard for understanding across many different sectors, basically what's the landscape of hacks across all these different sectors, how do these hacks actually happen, and how long does it take organizations to figure out that they've been hacked? Well, it turns out the average time to discovery is 562 days. And so anything we can do to decrease the time to discovery is really good, because the bar is pretty low here. So how do we actually do detection? Well, you need a lot of detailed information if you want to do really powerful detection on a given system. You need things like processes spawning, file system operations, like executions particularly, and writes. For example, I'll give a concrete example. What if some malware got onto your system and it turned off all the checkboxes for automatic security updates, and then it made another write to change the configuration of SSH, and they added a new key so they can just connect to that system whenever they want without a password, for example. So detecting those file system modifications, very important, as well as network activity, right? If all of a sudden there's some malware and it's connecting to a new server, you could have that event logged, theoretically, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about this category of detection. It's all the stuff in this bucket. So here are the detection topics for today. Security event logging, firewall logging, and the other side of the coin on the binary blacklisting and whitelisting, the actual logging. So security event logging. I tried to use a generic term for this because I didn't want to get too focused on OpenBSM specifically, especially because Apple just introduced a new framework in Catalina that might address some of this stuff. But really today, it's OpenBSM. That's what we've had built into macOS for the last several years. And I'm sure it'll hopefully stick around in the future. And it gives us a lot of those detailed event information that I showed on the last slide. But unfortunately, the problem with it is that it requires using a bunch of separate command line tools, setting up like your own custom launch and script, because it was built a long time ago. It was an outsourced project. It wasn't built by Apple internally. I believe it was McAfee that was contracted to build this. You can go on the Wikipedia. It's fascinating. But the point is that the logs are in a binary format. To get them in a format you can even read as plain text, you have to use this command line tool, PR audit. And if you want to kind of automate all this across your fleet, it's a lot of scripting. It's a lot of custom work. And so the feature request here is to kind of get rid of the need for doing all of that and just allow it to log directly to the unified system logging that was introduced, I believe, 2 versions ago in macOS. So that would eliminate the need for all this custom scripting and converting the binary logs to a regular log format, et cetera. The other issue is that the actual format of the logs, once you run them through PR audit, is not very friendly for actually doing alerting on top of it. It's not like beautiful JSON, like key value, where you can just extract out the fields that you want to alert on in something like Splunk or Elasticsearch, or Kibana, I mean. Instead, you really have to do a lot of work to get the logs parsed into a format that you can alert on. And so what would be really amazing is, and hopefully this would come sort of for free with the move to unified system log, but if you could actually have these logs in JSON format so they're really easy to parse and alert on in your centralized logging system, that would be really awesome. Okay. The other issue is that actually setting up all the configuration for OpenBSM itself to even turn it on to log the events that you care about, like those file system rights I was talking about earlier. The only way to do it is to manually, modify this file on disk at etc security audit control. And obviously that requires an agent, right? You can't modify random files on disk via MDM. So the feature request here is the ability to actually centrally manage the OpenBSM configuration via a configuration profile, so you don't have to deal with an agent, so you don't have to deal with touching that file on disk. Okay, this is really specific, but the actual logs are missing the parent PID, so you can't tell if some process actually created another process and that created another process. You can't really see the relationship in the chain there. In order to get that, you actually need to use other tooling, such as, I think Santa kind of helps solve this problem, and potentially OS Query as well. But it's a lot of kind of gluing together data from all these different sources, rather than it just being sort of beautifully all out of the box built in with OpenBSM. And so the feature request here is to update the version of OpenBSM that ships with macOS. It's quite a few versions behind what's available on other operating systems. And I believe the newer version does just include the parent PID anyway, so I think that would solve the problem. Okay, firewall logging. So I want to pause here. I actually should have put in a slide about this, but why is firewall logging actually important? It's because if you have firewall logging on every macOS device in your organization, what you end up getting, if you have centralized log collection, that's the big asterisk there, but if you have centralized log collection and you have firewall logging, you have built a distributed IDS, distributed intrusion detection system, because that means that, let's say an attacker does compromise one machine in your environment, and all of a sudden they fire up, Nmap, or they fire up, I don't know, Nessus or Metasploit or whatever, and they start scanning your network like crazy. All of a sudden, it's going to light up. If you have these logs being collected centrally, you're going to see exactly which machine is doing the scan and which subnet they're on, which VLAN they're on. You're going to know exactly where the attack started, right? And you'll be able to follow them, like from machine to machine, especially because you'll also have the host name. I mean, it's really amazing. So I think when I talk about this, people are like, why would I care about firewall logging? And it's like, because it's not the individual machine that we're concerned with. It's seeing kind of like the landscape of the network, and sort of regardless of what network, actually. As long as you have a concentration of employees, could be a remote office with no dedicated corporate network, no dedicated network security monitoring, but you all of a sudden sort of have it for free automatically. If you have, let's say, 10 employees in that office, and you're doing this on their machines, all of a sudden you do have network security in that environment. So that's pretty cool. Okay, this is kind of the obvious one, but being able to see the list of all the binaries that have executed across every device, across your company, it's a very similar idea to the one on the network side that I was just talking about. If you can actually collect the list of binaries that have been executed, you can also collect, let's say, the developer certificate, the team ID, and you have all that in a centralized log aggregation system. You can start to do really, really exciting things. Google actually does this with a sister project to Google Santa called Upvote. And what they do is, this is open source, by the way, not spilling any secrets, but it actually collects information about all the binaries that are executed from every laptop. And then there's like a public kind of like voting system. So like every employee can go and say, I want to say that this is actually legitimate software, or oops, maybe I actually downloaded malware, it seems to be doing something bad. And it's kind of like a herd mentality type of protection. So once you reach a certain threshold, it kind of gets whitelisted for everyone. So really, really exciting stuff that you can do. And you can imagine how, enterprise could actually even, if they wanted to, have a central repository of this stuff, any malware that they've found, share that with other companies, et cetera. It could make kind of really powerful alliances between enterprises and Apple that would actually allow for increased protections for maybe even all consumers, right? Because let's say that enterprises help identify new malware. You can imagine that the learnings from that being poured back into let's say, gatekeeper, right? So that, and the automatic malware removal tool built into macOS. So that all of a sudden now this malware that was identified by one company or one organization, one university, all of a sudden could protect, Apple's entire user base. Super cool stuff. Okay. Last thing I'll talk about, one more thing. I said I wasn't going to talk about physical attacks, but FileVault is so table stakes and such, so widely deployed that I wanted to give a special kind of like shout out just to FileVault issues. So there's a problem with trying to enforce FileVault via MDM, which is that the MDM protocol doesn't actually let you see all the different states that a device can be in and all the different information related to FileVault. It doesn't get returned to you. The only place you can get this information is with the FDE setup command line tool. And so again, you need an agent to get this information. So if we want to move to a world without agents, we're going to need to get this information from MDM. So things like, is it enabled? Is it completed? Is it paused because they're on battery? What's the progress percentage? If it's like a hard drive, it can take forever, right? Take hours to encrypt. And is there a pending reboot? Like pre-APFS, the device needed a reboot before the encryption would be totally finalized. So I guess the kind of like easier thing to do would be to just add these as things that are returned in maybe the device information MDM query or security info. The kind of wish list version is the device itself understanding what state it's in and when things change and just automatically sending that to the MDM server somehow. The MDM protocol doesn't really allow for that today, as far as I can think of, but that would be really awesome because obviously if it's just added to the security info command or the device information command, all of a sudden you have a situation where if you wanted to show like real-time disk encryption in like a web UI, say it's a hard drive and it's at 30%, right? All of a sudden the server has to ask like every 5 seconds, it has to pull the device and say, give me the security info. Oh, looks like it's 30%. Okay, 5 seconds later, give me the security info again. Okay, looks like it's at 40%, and you're just constantly pulling, and it's very inefficient. So it'd be really great if it could go the other direction and be kind of initiated by the client and just sort of streamed up to the server in real time. Okay, enforcement. So even though there's an incredible user experience, with APFS and the T2 enabled hardware nowadays, where FileVault can be enabled instantly, because the configuration profile was created at a time when that wasn't true, the config profile still requires an unnecessary reboot in order to actually enable FileVault, even on these brand new machines. So it would be really cool if the existing config profile for FileVault could take effect immediately during Setup Assistant and not require a reboot on devices where that's unnecessary. Okay. Last thing, I think this is the last thing on FileVault. The configuration profile requires that you put the username into the config profile to enforce FileVault. I imagine this has to do with secure token, making sure that only that user is getting the secure token. But it means it's really hard to do an MDM-only enforcement of FileVault because how are you necessarily supposed to know the username of that person who's using that computer ahead of time, especially if you're in a situation where you have a company, they have like 500 employees or 500 users, and they're rolling out their MDM solution for the first time, whether that's Fleetsmith or some other solution, right? They might not have the most accurate device inventory. They might not even know the full first name and last name of who's assigned to that device, much less the username. And so there needs to be a way to kind of like inject that in real time into the config profile, and there's no way to do that purely with MDM. And so in today's world, you need an agent to gather up the information on like what those usernames are that should be injected. It would be really great if the config profile allowed you to just say, hey, I don't know the username, so instead of like a string, maybe there's another key that's like use currently logged on user or something, and it just auto-populates it with that. So I kind of listed a bunch of alternative approaches under that feature request there, just because I don't really know what would be the easiest thing to implement, but hopefully this describes sort of the problem space. All right. To be continued. We covered hardening and we covered detection. Well, hardening was finished in today's talk, started in the previous one. There is kind of one last little bucket. There's not much in this bucket, but it is pretty interesting. And maybe if there's time, I can talk about it in Q&A. But this is really making it harder for an attacker to move to other devices within your environment after they've compromised, let's say, one or two of them. And there's a few different system configs and reporting and enforcement that could be done via configuration profiles that does not currently exist. Alrighty, shoutouts. So, Groob for his awesome research and blog posts on those intricate details around the MDM command for OS upgrades. Fleetsmith, engineering, product, and design for actually being able to build an incredible OS upgrade and FileVault experience for both IT and the employee, like end users, which actually avoids all the problems I described in this talk. Super amazing. PicmanSec, aka Michael George at Dropbox, one of my former teammates, for his really awesome blog post on the Dropbox blog called macOS Monitoring the Open Source Way, and for his valuable thoughts and feedback on the detection portion of this talk today. And last but not least, Apple's security engineering and MDM teams, because I think they're really continuing to improve both the platform security and the MDM management capabilities, and I'm super excited to see what the future holds there. So, thank you. And that's all, folks. Any questions?
Any questions for Jesse?
I've never had a lot of luck with the firewall on the Mac. Is that something that you guys have on in your organization and a nice way of doing it, or?
Never had any luck with what, sorry?
The firewall on the Mac.
With FileVault?
Firewall.
Oh, firewall.
Yeah.
Oh, can you elaborate on never had any luck?
Well, there was just never really a nice interface, and you turn it on and you just end up with so many things blocked. It was never particularly granular. I mean, the Windows one kind of just works, which was sort of the opposite, the experience on the Mac.
Yes, I can definitely address that. I think the particular thing that gives people the most trouble if they try to enforce it is the checkbox for block all incoming connections. That's the one where you're going to have some maybe not great user experiences. That does remind me, though, I think there is one thing that could be improved with the firewall management, and it's if it was possible to do like real-time whitelisting of compiled binaries. Maybe this is way too specific, but if you have like engineers in your environment and they're doing things like, let's say, compiling a agent written in Go, as ours is, and they're doing like local testing, and sometimes that requires listening on like a local port for incoming connections. All of a sudden, you have a situation where like that's changing, the binary is changing on every build, and so there's no way to really whitelist that through configuration profiles. You could script it through user libexec socket filter FW, which is the command line version of application layer firewall. You could script like through some crazy scripting. You could like detect maybe with FS events when there's a new binary in that folder and then automatically whitelist it. But yeah, it would be cool if you could do transitive whitelisting through a configuration profile for environments where you do still want the application layer firewall in a aggressive configuration, but you do still want to allow your developers to be productive and not click allow in a UI thing every single time they recompile. So I think maybe that could be, is that kind of what you were referring to, or?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for your comments here. And there's a call to action in a lot of these slides that basically say, I need your help to get this in, to get Apple to start to think about some of these changes.
Yeah.
Do you have a comprehensive list of radars that would be like, all right, so I've got an organization, and we represent about 600 Macs out there, and I definitely want every one of those improvements. How do we team up? How do we coordinate so that I can add my impact statement to yours, so that we can say, okay, my 600 is small, but if there's enough of me out there, or if we get the attention of somebody like an RMIT or a UTS or anybody else out there that has a huge number of endpoints, how do we help?
Great question. So I'm actually going to do a follow-up to both of these talks and turn this into a pretty long blog post. And in that blog post, I'm going to refer to all the radars that we are going to file for these issues. So I have not yet filed them, but I will be, and they will be linked in the blog posts so that we can all dupe them, assuming that everyone thinks these are important things. Yeah. Any questions about like any of the specific security stuff? 'Cause
I've got one question up at the
oh yeah.
back here.
Just as we were talking about firewalls, have you had any, or have you placed any requests specifically on egress-based firewalls?
On what base firewall?
Egress, the request starting from the device going to an endpoint. Because the
Oh.
firewalls that are natively built into
Oh,
macOS
you mean
are all egress.
kind of the idea I was talking about, where it reports every time there's a change?
Not just that, but being in a position then to manage that change. So to give you an example,
Yeah.
You would only want a device for all web browser activity to go to a proxy rather than going around the proxy. So you want to be in a position then to only allow AT443, well, obviously things happen on ports outside those, but to hit an endpoint that is known over those ports.
Oh, that's very interesting. No, I have not thought about that or requested it, but that's an interesting idea.
I've got a question. From a security standpoint of view, was there anything that Apple have announced recently at WWDC that you thought was something to keep an eye on and interesting in terms of how they're hardening and the direction they're going in?
Absolutely, yes. I actually talked about and gave like a lot of kudos to all the security improvements that Apple made and announced at WWDC. It's just that it was all in part one of the talk. But yes, absolutely. I'm super excited for what they're doing. And in particular, I really like the notarization stuff. So, you know, slowly we're moving to a world, and you know, they said this very explicitly, that in a future release of macOS, nothing that's not signed, well, double negative, things that are not signed won't run by default. There will always be, they were very careful to say, you know, there will always be a way to run whatever code you want on macOS. They said that very explicitly, but it just won't be the default. And I think that's a really incredible move that's going to protect, you know, enterprises and consumers. I think, and the fact that now in Catalina, there's going to be protections not just for kind of GUI-based apps or things that use LaunchD, which is typically GUI-based apps, but also, you know, raw binaries, things that like run in the background. Those will also be actually in scope of notarization and specifically like gatekeeper checks. So the first time, you know, you run a command line tool, it will actually still go through gatekeeper. So that's pretty cool.